On the 28th of February, 2026,
the United States and Israel conducted a series of joint airstrikes against Iran. These strikes killed dozens of top Iranian officials, including the Supreme Leader himself, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who has now been replaced by his son, Ayatollah Mojtaba Khamenei. With hundreds killed and injured across more than 10 countries, the war seems to be spiraling out of control. Hundreds of thousands have had to flee their homes, evacuating, searching for respite in this conflict. Still, the Trump administration seems unwilling or unable to define and delineate the conflict. Most recently, as of time of recording on the 10th of March, President Donald Trump has stated that only unconditional surrender would bring the war to an end. It is in this context that I spoke to Professor Andrew Reddie of the Goldman School of Public Policy here at UC Berkeley. He's also the founder of the Berkeley Risk and Security Lab. This is what he told me.
Professor Reddie, on behalf of the Berkeley Political Review, thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks, Pedro.
I want to get started by picking your brain about the attacks on Iran in a very general light, and later transitioning onto a more nuanced assessment of the impacts of the military operation on U.S. security strategy. So first and foremost, it's become clear that one of Trump's main goals in Iran must be regime change.
Yeah.
The U.S. attacks on Venezuela were individual and targeted. They aimed specifically at the deposition of Nicolás Maduro. The United States allowed and supported Delcy Rodriguez, his VP, to remain in power. This isn't the case with Iran. Trump has emphasized that various levels of leadership were identified and killed in order to decapitate the regime, sow chaos. Most recently, Trump has announced, as I said, that Iran must agree to unconditional surrender. What differentiates Iran and Venezuela? Why has the Trump administration taken such starkly different strategies in such a short time frame? Is it just a geographic difference, being that Venezuela is so much closer to the U.S., or do you think there are ideological and strategic components to these decisions?
It's a really good question. And again, I think it cuts in different directions. So it's likely the case that the success in Venezuela led to increased adventurism on the part of the Trump administration vis-a-vis Iran. But of course, as you point out there towards the end of your question, there are very different geographical realities, ideological realities, histories with the regime, the various different strengths of their military and their capabilities, and obviously the legacy of the 12-day war that occurred over summer of 2025. And so there's a lot of differences too. I think that ultimately, if the Trump administration had found somebody in the regime that was willing to kowtow to U.S. demands, they would have quite happily gone along with it in the same way they did it with Venezuela. That's not been forthcoming inside the Iranian regime. And in fact, the Assembly of Experts, the 88 clerics that chose Mojtaba Khamenei as his father's successor, made that very clear, right? They put into power yet another hardliner, and arguably somebody who's even more hardline than Ayatollah Khamenei himself. And so we'll kind of see how that plays out. But there are, very clear differences, and that's impacting kind of how the U.S. is attempting to, engage very early in the conflict. So seeking decapitation, not trying to, kidnap and take home. It's obviously Israel and its capabilities are also kind of a spoiler in that story. In Venezuela, the U.S. is operating entirely by itself. Here in the Middle East, there's an ally that has some sort of voice with regards to what the military operations are going to look like. And so in a lot of very important ways, it's quite different.
And these military operations, they've primarily been airstrikes, both in the case of Venezuela and in the case of Iran.
Yep.
But many pundits critique the idea of regime change from the air. Lots emphasize that in order to create real lasting change in Iran or in Venezuela or in any country, it's not possible to just bomb the nation from 20,000 feet. That we need boots on the ground, essentially. Do you think that Trump's current conflict strategy will allow for the toppling of the Islamic State, or will more and more varied intervention be required?
So in Venezuela, obviously there were airstrikes on important both military assets and also military adjacent assets in the economy as well. But bear in mind, there were boots on the ground. There were boots on the ground that ultimately, took Maduro back to the United States to stand trial. And so in the Iranian case, there's also conversations about whether the Kurds might end up fighting on the U.S. behalf to provide those boots on the ground. I think there's a lot of fear that they're not going to be strong enough to face up to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and any other military assets that Iran has on the ground. Ultimately, and I was telling you this in class today, right? War is a human endeavor, and it's still the case that kind of to control geography and certainly to control a polity, you need to have boots on the ground. What those boots end up looking like is the kind of the open question. There could have been the hope early in the Trump administration's plans for Iran that the pro-democracy movement that had been on the streets, I think it was 4 or 5 weeks prior, and that led to a severe Iranian crackdown, might have risen up again and provided an alternative to the Iranian regime. Thus far, that hasn't been forthcoming. Obviously, there are pretty significant Iranian dissents in the country itself. But they had not coalesced around any particular leader. And indeed, in the early days of this most recent conflagration, you've heard accounts that those that were on the pro-democracy side that looked like they might be potential leaders of the movement have actually been killed by the Iranian regime as well. And so there's this kind of leadership vacuum that's going to make it very difficult for the United States to achieve its goals in the country.
A leadership vacuum that has been filled, of course, by the Ayatollah's son.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, but again, what does this end up like? He controls the security apparatus, and the security apparatus is delighted with his appointment. That's not to say that there isn't a more moderate strain in the Iranian regime that is maybe making the argument that the hardline might not have been the cleverest choice. Because for the Iranians too, right, this is a conflict that appears to have, no pathways to ending, just in the same way for the Trump administration, it's the same. I mean, I think most analysts hear the Trump administration saying 4 to 5 weeks. I think now this morning it might have gone up to 8 weeks, right? That's, very ambitious. And so the lack of an off ramp applies to both sides.
And of course, there's the elephant, not in the room, the elephant outside of the room of the Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi, who's been on 60 Minutes, been on Politico, advocating for his case. Do you think that he could come back into the picture?
Oh, he hopes so. There doesn't seem to be much appetite on the part of any of the major players to bring him back in. I think there's potentially the idea that he offers something of a stopgap between the current regime and democratically held elections and what have you. And I think that that's how he's trying to position himself as well. But whether that's ultimately going to fly, who knows? I mean, again, sitting here this afternoon, and granted, this is the other thing we should say as well, there's just so much uncertainty, both in terms of how this all got started and where it's going to go, that nobody really can say. It seems vanishingly unlikely sitting here this afternoon that he would be welcomed in by the current regime to take part in a transition in the absence of a significant change in the course of the war.
Of course. And speaking still about the broad war, before jumping into more like defensive strategy.
Yeah.
There's a burning question about the attacks on Iran that I haven't really heard many people ask. Maybe they have. Essentially, it's why now? Iran's been threatening the U.S. for decades.
Yeah.
Trump has been vocally anti-Iranian for the longest time. He pulled out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2018. He's been rallying against Iran since. If I'm not wrong, the U.S. and Israeli strikes of Operation Midnight Hammer earlier last year were sold as having destroyed the nuclear program.
Yep.
And one could even argue that Trump's desire to win the Nobel Peace Prize, which was in the news earlier this year, should have disincentivized him from striking. So why now?
It's a good question. And I think this is one of the points of uncertainty that I mentioned before about, the struggle that we have understanding kind of where all this came from. There was a sense that potentially the Israelis moved first and the United States felt like they had to act. It is the case that the U.S. were flushing military assets to the region for weeks. So you had the Abraham Lincoln in the Indian Ocean, the Ford in the Mediterranean. And so they were appropriately staged to engage in an attack. Now, with that said, they're having to flush more forces to the region given where the conflict's gone. And so that suggests that things might have been a little bit more premeditated. I think some analysts, to some extent, including myself, thought that the show of force were more to kind of strengthen the bargaining hand in Geneva. So one of the things that was happening up until the day before the attack were talks between the Iranians and the Americans around some sort of new, concord around nuclear weapons. Obviously that failed, although if you were to listen to negotiators, particularly on the Iranian side, but also on the American side too, while there was no agreement, they didn't seem miles and miles away from each other. And so I think a lot of us, that was what drove some of the surprise on that Friday evening, very late here in California time, at least, right when this kind of kicked off. And so, you know, we'll see. And also too, it's important to note that different members of the administration have different answers for you,
Right.
regarding what was doing the driving. But also too, you know, it's a particular flavor of political scientist who wants to say like it's one thing. It can be a combination of factors, right? It can be the brutal crackdown on democratic demonstrators.
Trump there.
Exactly. It could be the nuclear weapons, which have come up again, time and again, in various different talking points from this administration. And it could have been this idea that if you don't go now, right, you're losing a window of opportunity amidst the buildup of Iranian arms vis-a-vis Israel in particular, but also the Americans too. And so one of the things that ended the conflagration over the summer was the fact that the Iranians had more or less expended all of their missiles, and the Israelis had expended a lot of their missile defense capabilities. And so it suited both sides to kind of walk away and to start again another day. And so that's maybe another explanation that, again, isn't being necessarily talked about a great deal, but I think it's very likely there's a combination of those factors.
Right.
And obviously it matters as well who, you know, ultimately gets to have that last briefing with President Trump and, you know, help him make that determination.
Speaking more concretely about changes in security policy, the Iranian regime has financed terrorist and insurgent proxy groups across the Middle East. Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, to mention a few. These groups have posed and contributed to serious threats to American and American allies' safety in the region for decades.
Yep.
With the fall of the Ayatollah, now it's harder to say if the fall of the Iranian regime as a whole, but with the fall of the Ayatollah at least. Do you foresee the U.S. security strategy in the region changing? Do you think Iran will finance these groups less?
It depends. If it's the current regime, there'll be very little delta. If you end up with the pro-democracy movement coming into power, then it'll be a sea change. And all of these clients of the current regime will be clientless. And so, you know, it's difficult to know what that necessarily means. It's not as if, you know, there's only one source of funding for these groups. And so there will be alternatives for the Houthis and Hezbollah in particular. But certainly it would have severe impacts on their ability to project their own power. So Hezbollah effectively has a polity in South Lebanon that is also, I mean, the conflict's regionalized, right? And so the Israeli troops are there today, right, as we speak.
700,000 evacuated from the south of Lebanon this morning.
Exactly. And so one of the things that underpins Hezbollah's ability to hold that territory are actually members of the Quds Force from Iran itself. And so one would presume that some of that support would go away. It's not as if all of the dynamics of the Middle East would change overnight, but you'd be losing a significant sponsor, right, of these groups.
And with this, obviously one of the main enemies of Hezbollah and Hamas has been Israel, who's constantly attacked them, a lot of times in retribution for attacks against them, with U.S. military support, or at least the U.S. selling arms to Israel. This has led to a lot of criticism of American presidents, specifically lately, when relationships with Israel had reached like a breaking point. Do you think that the decreased presence of Iranian proxy groups and possibly a pacified Iran could lead to a strategic shift away from Israel on the part of the U.S. government, especially given the difficult politics associated with Netanyahu?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be skeptical. I mean, also too, I think Netanyahu's leadership in Israel is predicated to some extent on being on a war footing. And so you see pretty significant changes in Israeli politics should the Iranian regime fall as well. So Israel is America's key ally in the region, and that's not going to change. Now, what has changed over time with things like the signing of the Abraham Accords is that the U.S. has relatively cordial relations with Jordan, with Saudi Arabia, with the Gulf states, all the places that have military bases that are now under attack from Iran. And so, you know, the balance of those ties might look different in a world in which, you know, you've the looming shadow of a Iranian regime that's antagonistic towards those allies and partners is no longer there. But I think that the relationship between the two countries is incredibly strong, and it goes in both directions. So I mean, you mentioned arms sales of the U.S. to Israel. The same thing happens in reverse. And so the ties are very, very close. Now, to some extent, there might be partisan differences between Democrats and Republicans. Historically, there's not been much daylight between the two political parties regarding its support for Israel. But some of the problems for Israeli security don't necessarily go away, right? They still got Syria on its border that still isn't entirely stable, although things are going there perhaps better than some of us thought that it might. And then obviously you've got the continued questions over Gaza and the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority as well, and Hamas as well, of course. And so, there's no kind of like magic wand. I mean, the hope is that things will get better, but there's no guarantee.
You mentioned Saudi Arabia and the other Middle Eastern nations. They've been hit by Iranian strikes in the past few days.
Correct.
Do you think they're going to get more directly involved?
It's a kind of interesting. I think it cuts two ways. I mean, that's a possibility. I think perhaps more likely is that they might tie the hands of the Americans and say, pull back a little bit here. Particularly as their economies get hit as oil and gas exporters. I mean, our economy is getting hit, and the global economy is getting hit by virtue of this reliance on oil and gas from the region. So the LNG terminals in Dubai, for example, have been entirely turned off, and Strait of Hormuz is a key choke point for global shipping. And so I think I'd be looking to them more as reining in the United States rather than getting involved in the conflict themselves. Although, previously there was a lot of concern that should Iran manage to get a nuclear weapon, that the Saudis would also pursue their own. And so, it's not entirely outside the realm of the possible that they get themselves involved. I'd worry more about Saudi Arabia in that context than the Gulf countries or Kuwait, all of which have been hit by attacks. There doesn't seem to be a lot of appetite for lobbing missiles back. Primarily, there's been a reliance on the U.S. to do that on their behalf. How many attacks you can have on hotels, though, civilian infrastructure, without having some sort of response, and without fears that you look weak to your domestic public, that's a question. And again, far more uncertainty than certainty around how kind of that all unfolds.
This is, of course, a domestic public that the Gulf monarchies have a fraught relationship with a lot of the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And are upheld by these willing subjects, in a sense. So it's interesting dynamics. You mentioned Saudi Arabia getting a nuclear bomb. Hypothetical idea, right? Obviously, though, a war with Iran has been motivated and pushed by Iranian nuclear ambitions.
Correct.
Something that the JCPOA attempted to crack down upon, Trump pulled out, as we mentioned, etc. The U.S. president's willingness to threaten allies. Jumping a little bit to the side, the U.S. president's willingness to threaten allies. I'm thinking of the EU, specifically with Denmark, with Greenland, or even Canada, constantly calling it the 51st state out, has led many to wonder whether the U.S. nuclear umbrella, very specifically the nuclear umbrella, is still protecting its allies. If the U.S. will be willing to give up San Francisco for Paris, or Seattle for Berlin. With these collective security agreements weaker than ever before, how does the U.S.'s military intervention in Iran contribute to certain dynamics of nuclear proliferation? You mentioned Saudi Arabia, but I can also think of Poland in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and other similar cases.
Cool. So, I mean, just one point of clarity. So the partnership arrangements with the Saudis and the Gulf states do not include a nuclear umbrella on the part of the U.S. So the nuclear conversation is a little bit divorced from that. But in terms of more general, right, our relationship with NATO and our East Asian partners, South Korea and Japan, there's big fears. And to be fair, that was predating this particular adventurism in either Venezuela or Iran. I will say that the partners and allies in the region are very much acting as if it's normal United States, right? Collective security commitments. Whether they can trust that to hold or not, who knows? But certainly amongst European countries, there is a significant fear that the U.S. will not come to their aid in the event that, in that case, they find themselves in trouble with the Russians. That's the proximate security challenge in Europe. And it's leading to a significant amount of indigenization of defense capability in Europe. It's going to take time for the Europeans to kind of manage that. But certainly there's appetite for it. And you'll see a significant increase we've already seen a significant increase in defense spending amongst a lot of European countries, conversations about France extending its own nuclear guarantee to other Northern European countries, not all European countries. I mean, we're even having conversations that revisit German rearmament and what that would look like, right? So, bear in mind that, one of NATO's raison d'etres was to try to avoid German militarization. So, we're definitely seeing the fraying of our alliance relationships. And I think the argument is becoming very hard for liberals and moderates to make in the United States to partners and allies is that a Trump administration is an aberration, because European countries are looking at the United States and saying 8 of the last 12 years are going to be populist, right, or in orientation. And so to what extent do you expect us to plan for a Biden-esque, right, security environment or security commitment versus a Trumpian one? And at the very least, they'll have to hedge against there being a Trumpian one. And that can mean standing on their own 2 feet, but it also can mean engagement with the Chinese. So that's something that the Canadians have done rather masterfully over the last couple of months. We will see Chinese cars on Canadian roads and opening up the North American market. And so, it's something that worries me a great deal.
It's interesting because I feel like I've always heard collective security dynamics, specifically the nuclear umbrella, being a trade-off between security and autonomy. The EU, or European states, and the East Asian allies as well, have decided to give up a lot of their autonomy militarily in exchange for security. And that's benefited the US because the US did not want nuclear proliferation.
Yep.
With the US withdrawing its security guarantees, as you've mentioned, we could see nuclear proliferation start up as states reclaim their autonomy.
Correct.
Do you think the US will react negatively to that? Would Trump invade a European nation if it developed nuclear weapons?
I don't think so. I think that they are. I don't know that they've internalized the degree to which having U.S. say over military strategy in European and East Asian allied countries is useful to the U.S. in terms of procurement. So selling the F-35, for example, to these countries, but also making sure that they're integrated into the fighting force if you were to find yourself in a situation where you were trying to fight the Russians or the Chinese, right? So the requirements that we have vis-a-vis interoperability inside of NATO is a good example of that. But ultimately, like, the nearest term proliferators that we're concerned about are Poland and South Korea, neither of which, if they achieve nuclear weapons, would lead to a lot of happiness on the part of the United States. But I also don't see a world in which they would try to forcefully. Yeah, exactly. I think it'd be much more likely to be a slap on the wrist via the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and associated UN bodies around that particular proliferation. But the very fact that we're having these conversations suggests that the degree of trust in the United States to actually undertake its security commitments abroad is significant. I'll also say, like, to some extent, it's also driven by geopolitics too. I mean, there's sometimes a tendency to kind of blame the United States for all of the things, but one of the reasons that South Korea wants a nuclear weapon is it could be driven by the fact that North Korea has them now, and then with the Poles, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is doing a lot of the driving too.
Right.
And so what we see are all of these geopolitical headwinds, which are terrible for international peace and security, which mean changing a lot of the historical security architectures that we relied on, particularly in the post-Cold War era. But even from the Cold War era, given that you've got a three-body problem and then all of these other challenges regionally on the margin. I think, while we're zoomed out here, I think one of the things that really concerns me is that you've got adventurism in the Western Hemisphere, you've got adventurism in the Middle East, there's talk of adventurism in Cuba, and then you've got the challenge that modally in both the Biden administration and also inside of some of Trump's DOD, they're very focused on China as the rising threat. And so, the United States is not in a position to be everywhere all the time, right? And so, that picking and choosing appears to be, something that we haven't been able to do.
Do you worry that China is going to take advantage of this moment to attack Taiwan?
I don't know. So first of all, they're delighted with how this is playing out. I don't know. I mean, Taiwan's a really thorny problem. You've just played a Taiwan Straits War game in my class. You know how challenging that conflict is. there are some fears that they're looking at the lessons learned from places like Ukraine, but certainly they're not going to be angry at the U.S. turning its attention once again towards the Middle East. And even, the fact that we're having even the shortest conversations about boots on the ground is cause for delight in Beijing, given the disasters that were Iraq and Afghanistan that obviously we just got ourselves out of. And so, that's definitely a fear. But Taiwan's hard. Attacking territory over water, and we've seen with Ukraine, holding territory is incredibly difficult, particularly if the Pali don't want you there. But that said, I've got a colleague at SAIS, Hal Brands, who's made the argument that 2027, China is ready to go. Others put it a little bit later. I think that really one of the lessons of Ukraine, if I were sitting in Xi's shoes, is that you're actually better trying to inculcate yourself with the domestic politics such that you create kind of the drivers for domestic shifts that move in your direction. Because that's actually what was happening in Ukraine. So Ukraine historically flipped between pro-Russian and pro-European political parties. As soon as Russia invaded Crimea, that hardened the pro-European win and made it very difficult for any pro-Russian parties to win in the elections. And so, I think that if the Chinese are being clever, they're learning that lesson from Ukraine, not, hey, we should go in. Although, as we've talked about in class as well, the Russians made, fairly obvious strategic errors that I'm sure the Chinese wouldn't make in a conflict over Taiwan. But it's thorny. I mean, the thorniness for the U.S. is projecting power that far away from the U.S. mainland. Obviously, we've got Guam to like Hawaii, bases in Japan, etc. But even there's questions about the appetite of our East Asian partners to get themselves involved over Taiwan, right? Particularly when our own policy documents maintain strategic ambiguity, right, over our own commitment to the island. So yeah, again, we are in an unprecedented geopolitical moment that is far more difficult and means lots of more work for international relations scholars than perhaps is normal.
Part of what makes this moment so unprecedented and so new is, of course, the development of new technologies.
Yeah.
The most buzzwordy of all, of course, is AI. And I have to ask, veering slightly away from Iran, Anthropic's AI systems were used, reportedly, at least, in the Trump administration's abduction of Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro and in the ongoing operation in Iran. Nevertheless, Anthropic and the Department of Defense, Department of War have had a very brash, very public breakup, with OpenAI kind of filling in Anthropic's shoes.
Or XAI.
Or XAI, to be seen.
Yeah.
The divide between Trump, or his Secretary of War, Hegseth, and Anthropic reportedly originated over some red lines that Anthropic had drawn, refusing to allow mass surveillance or autonomous weapons systems powered by their AI technology. I have a few loose questions here. What role do you see AI models playing in the war of the future? I know autonomous weapons systems tends to be misinterpreted. People tend to assume that it means a drone that flies by itself and kills people without any human input, but it can actually have a more nuanced meaning, meaning it does certain things autonomously but requires human intervention later on. Do you think that U.S. security strategy changes in the face of AI integration?
It's a good question. So, in a proper class, right, I've got my continuum of decision support that AI tools are used for. And it's important to decompose, right, the AI in scare quotes. So you've got algorithmic AI systems that we've used in military settings for 7 decades, particularly for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. You've got generative AI systems, which is more of the Claude integration that we're talking about here. And then down the road, right, agentic systems that you set off to perform a task and they do it of their own accord. The Claude tools that we're talking about in the context of Venezuela and Iran are primarily serving inside of classified compute environments where Claude Gov, which is the Anthropic's offering, is the only offering that's actually allowed on classified networks. And it's offered inside of tools from places like Palantir. And so effectively what you're getting is a UI or, a UX mechanism. So you're interacting with complex systems through a chatbot effectively. That's the modal way in which generative AI tools are being used, because of course, like LLMs aren't necessarily the thing for military applications. But as we go from kind of intelligence surveillance to data fusion to wargaming, something I care a lot about, right? To courses of action generation, to targeting applications, to kinetic applications of force. Basically, the debate we're having is where the dotted line is over which we have moral qualms versus not having moral qualms. So we're quite happy using systems that leverage AI tools to make decisions about predictive maintenance, predictive logistics, right? Moving people and things around the world as a military. Totally fine, right? Failure modes are innocuous. Where things get a little bit more interesting is when you start thinking about using these tools to come up with new strategies or doctrine that human analysts might not have come up with by themselves. Even more problematic for targeting applications. And so this is where Gospel and Lavender, the tools used by the Israelis in Gaza, came under attack, because here you've got effectively that same interface that I mentioned before on top of an algorithmic AI system that was doing target selection, which some argue led to them attacking more civilians than might have otherwise been the case. And then on the kinetic applications of force, and then outside the United States, we don't do that, right? So we effectively eschew autonomous weapons and say, right, we're not in that business. We've got the DoD AI principles, we've got 3000.09, and so we don't use tools that can detect and engage targets. Now, there's a little bit of sleight of hand there, because there are military assets that wouldn't work if a human was in the loop. So things like CWIS, Gatling guns, or missile defense assets, right? Their human beings are too slow to be at the speed of relevance, right, for shooting cruise missiles out of the sky, right, coming towards a naval asset. And so we kind of get around that by saying, okay, that's a semi-autonomous system. It has a switch on and off, and, we're good to go. I will say that in places like Geneva, where we have the UN meetings on the Convention for Certain Conventional Weapons, which I've talked about with you is the worst name ever for a convention at the UN, we're having conversations as if lethal autonomous weapons were kind of like in the future, but they're actually deployed today in Ukraine. So Ukraine has
drones.
That's relatively small drones that leverage computer vision models to determine that's a Russian tank, that's not a Russian tank, and then drops ordnance, right, based on that answer. Primarily because the Russians were jamming piloted drones. And so in the light of that jamming, the Ukrainians said, well, I still need to get force on target. Autonomy is going to be my way to do that. And, they're relatively unapologetic about it, right? Because from their perspective, if you want us to win, this is the tool that it will take in order for us to win. And so really the exigencies of war overcome a lot of this kind of moral qualm conversation. But the moral qualm conversation is exactly what the debate is between Anthropic and DoD. So DoD's position is that you're a vendor to the government. Once you give us the tool, we should be able to do whatever we want with it, so long as we follow the law. And Anthropic's position is no. When we signed our contract originally, we said we had a usage policy that said you can't use these tools for mass surveillance and autonomous weapons, are the two carve-outs that they have in their usage policy. And they say, this is what you, the DoD, committed to, and we want to keep those carve-outs. And so that's what the debate is. And sure, there was clunkiness in terms of how that Anthropic and DoD contractor relationship looked in practice. I think at base, the issue is that AI and AI tools and technologies are very different than the normal type of procurement that DoD is doing, right? It's not an aircraft. It's not an aircraft carrier. It's not even a radar system, right? There's a lot more kind of hand-holding that comes alongside it. And so, that's kind of what's playing out. And of course, the real challenge with Anthropic and DoD is that both sides have no incentive whatsoever to cave, because from the DoD's perspective, they're like, all lawful uses, this is what the standard ought to be. And their base likes that argument and likes that they're kind of hammering on a San Francisco based viewed to be liberal, right, company.
Not to mention their personal links with OpenAI and with XAI.
Sure. And then on the other side, you've got Anthropic, who are messaging to, right, a relatively liberal customer base and seeing a lot of market gains from this conflagration with DoD, because you've got, right, I saw an estimate of around 1.2 million accounts being started on Claude, right, civilian, over the weekend that kind of this news broke. And so, I think that the unfortunate thing is that ultimately there are mechanisms for dealing with contractual disputes We know this. There's even mechanisms for dealing with contractual disputes among military contractors, but those were not followed. This very much became kind of this court of public opinion back and forth, and so it's still playing out as we speak. Just yesterday, Anthropic sued the U.S. government following the USG telling everybody that Anthropic was a security supply chain risk, and so they did that on procedural grounds primarily, and so it's still playing out. And again, very similar to the Iran case, we'll see. And there's a lot of uncertainty over both how it starts and also where it's likely to go looking forward.
Well, thank you, Professor, for this tour de force.
Thanks, sir.
Everything happening in U.S. security policy.
No worries.
My name is Pedro Ezquer. This is for the Berkeley Political Review. It was an interview with Professor Andrew Reddie. Thank you. See you next time.